This Torah class is brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.
Tisha B'Av, it's the worst day of the year. Nobody wants to be here. It's such a miserable day that the Navi Yirmiyah cursed the day of Tisha B'Av, the day of his birth. Yirmiyah Navi was born on Tisha B'Av, and he cursed the day of his birth. In fact, the Mishnah says at the end of Masechta Tainis, on Daf Chaf Vav Amud Beis, that 5 tragedies occurred on Tisha B'Av, beginning with the first Tisha B'Av in history, where the Chazal tell us that the Meraglim, the spies, came back with their bad report about Eretz Yisrael. And the Pasuk says, Vayivku ha'am b'layla hahu, that the Jewish people cried on that night. And God looks down from heaven and He says, why are you crying? I told you it's a good land. I told you, Toiv ha'aretz ma'od ma'od. And you're crying. You're crying for nothing. Atem b'chisem b'chiyah shalchinam. V'ani koivea lachem b'chiyah l'doros. I'll give you a good reason to cry on this night. And the Mishnah continues, the first Beis HaMikdash was destroyed on Tisha B'Av. The second temple was destroyed on Tisha B'Av. The city of Beitar was destroyed on Tisha B'Av. And Tornis Rufus, Harasha, plows the city of Jerusalem on Tisha B'Av. The prophet Yirmiyahu had very good reason to curse the day of his birth. But amazingly, throughout history, Tisha B'Av has been somewhat of a lightning rod for Jewish tragedy. The city of Alexandria, which was much greater than Beitar, was destroyed on Tisha B'Av. The Jewish community of England, they were expelled on Tisha B'Av. France, in the year 1295, the year Kale Garesh Yigarsh. I'll tell you a little secret. If you ever see a Jewish date and you were wondering, well, what does that correspond to in the English calendar? There's a very easy formula to remember. If you add the year 1240 to the Jewish date, you get the secular date. In the year Kale is 55. If you add 1240 in the year 1295, French Jewry was expelled. World War I broke out on Tisha B'Av. I remember when I was a kid, it was a year like this year. It was a year like this year when Tisha B'Av came out on Shabbos, and it was the week before my bar mitzvah. And I'm walking to shul, my bar mitzvah was Parshas V'aschanan. I'm walking to shul Shabbos Tisha B'Av. And I look a block ahead to where the shul was supposed to be. Shul was gone. The shul burnt down on Tisha B'Av. But likely the worst tragedy that happened since Churban Beis HaMikdash, and it happened on Tisha B'Av, was the tragedy of the Gerushe Sfarad, the tragedy of the Spanish Inquisition. We know already from the time of the destruction of the first Beis HaMikdash, when the Jews left Israel, where did they go? Well, many Jews went to Europe, many Jews went to Spain. And at the end of the exile, at the end of the 70 years, Ezra issues a declaration. And he calls all the Jews from all over the world back to Eretz Yisrael. And not too many Jews came with him. Most Jews stayed in Babel. Many Jews stayed in Europe. Many Jews stayed in Spain. And then, after the destruction of the Second Temple, you have more Jews being exiled to Spain. So just imagine, in the year 68 of the Common Era, you have these 2 groups of Jews in Spain, Jews who had been there since Churban Mayis Rishon, and now Jews who are there after the destruction of the Second Temple. And then, in the 10th century, upon the decline of the great Torah academies in Sura and Pumbedisa, Spain becomes the epicenter of Torah Jewry. So you should know, Spain was a major Torah community for about 1,400 years, from the year 68 of the Common Era until 1492. I just want you to know a point of historical interest. I'm sure many of you are familiar with the expression, the Golden Age of Spain. Lai haya v'lai nivra. There never was a Golden Age of Spain. It's true. There was never a Golden Age of Spain. Spanish history was replete with massacre, pogrom, murder, persecution, non-stop. Hundreds of thousands of Jews were burned alive, tortured, converted. You see, Jewish history is relative. Golden Age of Spain, there was no Golden Age of Spain. Rabbi Kitov writes, this is a classic Jewish phenomenon. They could torture us, they could throw us in the fire, they could persecute us, and as soon as we leave, we're like, wow, the good olden days back in Spain. Same thing when we left Mitzrayim. Mitzrayim was a Holocaust. They threw our babies in the Nile, they built our babies into their buildings, and as soon as we leave, Zacharnu es hadaga. Remember the fish? Remember the cucumbers? Mitzrayim was like a sushi station, Klal Yisrael said. But that's Jewish history. We could be tortured, we could be thrown in the gas chambers, and then we look back longingly at the good old days of how things used to be. There was no good... Now you should know, there was a 200-year window where we had a degree of respite. And ironically, it was only under the control of the Arabs. As soon as the Christians came and took over Spain, it was one massacre after another. Now, we may know a lot of information about Spanish Jewry, but most of what we know probably comes from secular sources. What I would like to present to you today is what is considered the most authoritative first-hand account of the Spanish Inquisition from one of the greatest Torah sages who were alive in the time, none other than Rabbi Don Yitzchak Abarbanel, the Abarbanel, who lived from 1438 to 1508. Now, of course, we know that Abarbanel wrote many great Sfarim. He wrote a commentary on Tanakh, which is his magnum opus. But the Abarbanel also wrote a commentary on the Haggadah called Zevach Pesach. The Abarbanel wrote a commentary on the coming of Mashiach. He wrote a trilogy. The name of the trilogy is Migdal Yeshuais. And the Abarbanel begins his career in Portugal. What's he doing in Portugal? What's a nice Jewish rabbi doing in Portugal? Well, he's an advisor to King Alfonso. The year 1481, Alfonso dies. Alfonso was a righteous ruler. Alfonso was taken over by his son, Wao, Joao, with a little zarka over the A. And Wao immediately executes all of his father's advisors. And Abarbanel gets an email, he gets a message, that Wao would like to ask Eitzah. And Abarbanel is apprised that Wao does not want to ask Eitzah. Wao wants to chop off his head. So Abarbanel flees Portugal. And Wao gets wind of the fact that the Abarbanel is running, and the pursuers are at the Abarbanel's back, and the Abarbanel crosses the border into Spain with pursuers right at his back, just seconds ahead of his pursuers. And the Abarbanel comes to Spain penniless, in complete anonymity, which is a good thing for a rabbi. And he arrives in Toledo. Nobody knows who he is. That's the best thing. He writes his Sfarim, he writes a commentary on Yehoshua, on Shoftim, on Shmuel. But it's not long until the Abarbanel is summoned by King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella. They recognize his talent. The Abarbanel becomes the finance minister of Spain. And in a very short amount of time, the Abarbanel raises Spain up to become the world financial center, the world superpower. Ferdinand and Isabella then embark on their great ambition. The name of their ambition was Reconquista. Reconquista means to free the Iberian Peninsula from Arab control in the year 711. The year 711, the Arabs came, they crossed the Strait of Gibraltar. And I happen to know there are some people from Gibraltar, they email me, they watch on Torah anytime. And they cross the Strait of Gibraltar, and they head into the Iberian Peninsula, and the Arabs take control of the Iberian Peninsula, and King Ferdinand and Queen Isabella, their mission is Reconquista. They're going to reconquer Spain, they're going to reconquer the Iberian Peninsula. Comes the year 1487, Malaga falls to Christian control. There's only one more Arab stronghold in the entire Iberian Peninsula. Who knows what that is? Granada. Granada is the one area of the Iberian Peninsula now under control of the Arabs. And Ferdinand and Isabella, all steam ahead, they're going to attack Granada. This was considered one of the greatest military moments in history. The attack of Granada. And Ferdinand and Isabella conquer Granada. Now the Iberian Peninsula is totally under Christian control. And this arrogant king comes back to his palace. And he says to himself, Ayomer Isa Beliboy, how can I appease my God? After all, Spain had newly embraced Christianity as the religion of the area. The only way I could show gratitude to my God is to gather all the wretched Jews who walk in darkness and teach them the true religion. And if they don't accept, they're out of here. I'm going to expel them from the country. It says, Abarbanel Yatza Dvar HaMelech V'dasai, like the dust of Paras Umadai. And you should know it happened in the ominous year 1492. Many of the Gedolim who lived in those times, many of the Achronim, they looked for a remez in the Tanakh. Where is the year 1492 alluded to in the Psukim of the Torah? And the Abarbanel writes, it's alluded to in the Pasuk, Mizarei Yisrael Akabtzenu. Mizarei, Gematria 252. I told you before, if you want to translate a Jewish date into a secular date, you add what? 1240. What's 252 plus 1240? 1492. Mizare Yisrael Akabtzenu, or remez to 1492. By the way, the Ramah, Minhag Ashkenaz, comes from the Psak of the Ramah. The Ramah had a Talmud. His name was Rav David Gans. Rav David Gans was a young boy living in Germany. But he had a tshuka, he had a cheshek, he had a desire to learn Torah from the Ramah. So you know what he did? He walked from Germany to Krakow. Hundreds of miles. How'd he get there? He walked. Why? Because he wanted to learn Torah. The Shiur, it's too far. It's 12 minutes away. It's too hot outside. He walked hundreds of miles as a young boy. Why? You have a good Rebbe, the Ramah. You got to go. No excuses. By the way, the Ramah saw that this Talmud was a great historian. He encouraged him to write a work on history called the Tzemach David. He was one of the great astronomers of the time. He conversed. We have correspondence between the Tzemach David and the great astronomers of the time, Tycho Brahe, Johann Kepler. Says Abarbanel, the decree went forth that in 3 months' time, every last Jew in Spain either convert or they're expelled. And what month was the scheduled expulsion? Av, the month of Av. Says Abarbanel, frighteningly, not only did Ferdinand pick the month of Av, but the dagger in the heart was Thursday, August 2nd, 1492. Tisha B'Av was the scheduled date of the expulsion. Says Abarbanel, did Ferdinand know anything about Tisha B'Av? How do you know about Tisha B'Av? Says Abarbanel, V'hu lo yada mizeh hazman davar, he knew nothing of the date. Ke'ilu min hashamayim hidrichuhu lahagbalas hazman hazeh. He was divinely guided to choose the day of Tisha B'Av. Says Abarbanel, I was sitting in the palace and I couldn't keep my mouth closed. I risked my life. I screamed with every fiber of my being, what do you want from these people? What do you have against them? You want money? I'll pay you a hefty sum ransom for every Jew. Money's not an issue. What do you have against them? Says Abarbanel, I screamed at the king. I screamed at the queen. And I shook them up. And you should know about a day before the edict was about to go into effect, Ferdinand and Isabella were about to reconsider. But then, storming into the room was Torquemada. Torquemada was the terrible and great inquisitor of the Spanish Inquisition, Thomas de Torquemada. He came running in with his cross, ranting and raving. He shook Ferdinand and Isabel to the core. Abarbanel says, as bad as Ferdinand was, it's always the wife. It was her fault. She was the Satan. V'hasatan oimedes liminoi l'sitnoi, says Abarbanel. She was inciting him, and they asked Abarbanel to step out. And they signed the edict. By the way, Torquemada was Queen Isabella's confessor. You know what the confessor was? They would take a Jew, They would put him on wooden planks. They would tie his hands on one end, his feet on the other end. They would start stretching him out like in Sodom. They would then take rusty screwdrivers and screw them up your fingernails and your toenails. And they would say, "Are you a Christian or are you dead?" And Turkamada, this was his job. He was the mashgiach on this. He was the great confessor. And in 1492, he became the Grand Inquisitor. By the way, within a few years of his assumption of the post, he took some 30,000 lives in Spain. When you walked down the street in Spain, you heard the cries of the torture victims of Turkamada. When you walked down the street and you looked up, you saw smoke from flesh burning of people who did not want to convert. Says Abarbanel, since the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, we never had a tragedy like the Spanish Inquisition. How many Jews were forced to leave Spain during that period of time? Primarily 3 months between Shavuos Tammuz and Tisha B'Av. 300,000 Jews. Says Abarbanel, I among them. I was given exclusive rights to remain the finance minister, but I chose to go into exile with my brethren. And as we were leaving, August 2nd, Thursday, 1492, we were comforted by one thing only. Yatsa Malkam Lefnehem Vashem Berosham. We felt the presence of Hashem leaving together with us. And where did we go? We had no idea where we were going. Some went to Portugal, some went to Navarre. We suffered, we were broken. Many took ships, many of the ships sunk. I myself, says Abarbanel, made my way to Naples in the year 1493. Says Abarbanel, the year Gerim Hayisem. Gerim is Gematria 253. You add the 1240, 1493. One of the great works of Jewish history, the Seder HaDoros. I once met a Yid in Muncie. He's a descendant of the Seder HaDoros. Seder HaDoros is such an important work. The Chidah himself wrote footnotes on the Seder HaDoros. Seder HaDoros records was just one of the most awful incidents you'll ever hear. There was one particular man and his young son who were escaping by ship. Their elderly grandfather was with them. The man was starving. He was dying of starvation. The father doesn't know what to do. How's he going to take care of his aged father? He goes to the baker. He says, "Baker, I need a loaf of bread." The baker said, "Nothing doing." The man takes his young son. He trades in his son for a loaf of bread to feed his ailing father. He comes back to his father. His father had already went to the next world. Goes back to the baker. He says, "Give me my son back." Baker says, "No thanks, keep the bread." Says Abarbanel, since Golos Yerushalayim, we never had a tragedy like the Spanish Inquisition. Marv Rabbi Sai. You think about this historical incident, you think about the facts, and I have one very simple question for you. Here we are, it's Tisha B'Av, it's a day of crying. You look through the kinnis, we don't just cry for Churban Beis HaMikdash. In Minhag Ashkenaz, Kinah Chaf Aleph, Arzei Levanoin, we cry about the 10 martyrs, Asar Harugei Malchus. Kinah Chaf Hei, Kinah Lamed Gimel, the Gzeros Tatnu, the year 1096, the Crusades. It didn't even happen on Tisha B'Av. We cry for the Crusades. Kinah Mem Aleph, Shali Srufa Ba'esh. We cry for the burning of the Talmud, 1242. Didn't happen on Tisha B'Av. But we recognize, we understand, all Jewish tragedy traces back to Churban Beis HaMikdash. Isn't there something so glaringly and conspicuously absent from the liturgy on Tisha B'Av? What happened to the tragedy that the Abarbanel writes is the single greatest tragedy since Churban Beis HaMikdash? Not one word. We don't mention one word about the Spanish Inquisition on Tisha B'Av. And here it is. We even have for the Holocaust, the 10 martyrs, the Crusades, Chmielnicki, everything. Not a word for the Spanish Inquisition. And Ribbono Shel Olam, it happened today. It didn't happen at a different time of the year. It's the one tragedy that happened on Tisha B'Av. And we don't mention a word. Are we missing something? I want to share with you a historical fact. August 2nd, Thursday morning, 1492. As the Yidden are leaving their home, as they're leaving Spain, the Gedolei Yisrael of the time, the Abarbanel among them, paskined as a one-time measure that orchestras should play orchestral music for the exilees as they're leaving. On Tisha B'Av, music. Yes. How could they do such a thing? Firstly, to boost their spirits. It was pikuach nefashos. They could have died of depression. Secondly, it was a way of expressing gratitude that they did not succumb to the pressures of conversion. You know, in 1391, 101 years earlier, 200,000 Yidden converted to Christianity. First time in history. But most importantly, you know why they played music when we left Spain in 1492? To drive home a very important lesson. To teach Klal Yisrael. We never cry when we leave Galos. We only cry when we leave Yerushalayim. Yeah, it was tragic. It was devastating. 300,000 Yidden, homeless, evicted. But we never belonged in Spain. Yeah, we had nice homes. We had nice houses. We drove nice cars. We had nice watches. We had nice clothing. But it was Galos. And we don't cry when we leave Galos. Because we're not comfortable in Galos. Because we're not supposed to be in Galos. And it's only a matter of time until we're out of here. I'll tell you a very frightening thing. The Seder HaDoros writes that during the times of the Crusades, of all the communities in Europe, the one that was massacred and devastated more than any other community was Varmaisa, Worms, in Germany. Why Worms? Because when Ezra went back to rebuild the second Beis HaMikdash, he sent a message to the Jews of Worms, return, come back to Eretz Yisrael, join your brethren. And the community of Varmaisa said, no thanks. You stay where you are in your great Jerusalem, and we'll stay where we are in our small Jerusalem. Said the Seder HaDoros in the name of the Sma, that was their undoing. They were too comfortable in Galos. Their homes were too nice. They were too established. We have Ram Saba. Ram Saba is one of the greatest of the Gedolei Gerushei Sfarad. Rabbi Avram Saba writes, what was the reason for the downfall of Spanish Jewry? Shahayu boinim charavois lamai. Because they invested all their time in building nice houses. Be'erez of Asikiyos Hachemda. That showed they were under the illusion that they would remain in Spain forever. And I believe very firmly that the reason why there's no mention of Spanish Jewry in the Kinnis of Tisha B'Av is for the same reason why they played music when they left Spain. Because we never cry when we leave Galos. We only cry when we leave Yerushalayim. That's the lesson of the downfall of Spanish Jewry. Don't get too comfortable. Not in America, not in New York, not in Forest Hills, not in Kew Garden Hills, not in the Five Towns, and not in Muncie. Don't get too comfortable. Because we don't belong here. And it's only a matter of time. Because as grandiose an age as the Golden Age of Spain, it doesn't hold a candle to the Golden Age of America. You want to know how comfortable we are in America? They never got this comfortable in Spain. Intermarriage rate of 70%. They never even cracked 10%. They weren't that comfortable. And even among us, from Yidden, how much emotional energy do we invest on our homes, on our cars, on our possessions? Because we think, what a wonderful Gullus America. Hate to break it to you. It's only a matter of time. Reb Chaim Volozhiner, the father of the concept of yeshiva. The concept of yeshiva, as we know it today, is from Reb Chaim Volozhiner. And one day in the yeshiva, all the Talmidim are davening, and all of a sudden they hear a wailing coming from none other than Reb Chaim himself. And the Talmidim are frightened, Talmidim are scared. Why is the Rosh Yeshiva crying? Chaim Volozhiner, the primary disciple of the Goin. And they're too embarrassed to ask Reb Chaim, so they send Reb David Tevel, the Nachlas David, please go to the Rosh Yeshiva, ask him, why are you pained? Right after the davening, Reb Chaim goes into his private study. Reb David Tevel follows him into the study. He says, Rebbe, you shook us up. Why were you crying? Reb Chaim was reluctant to reveal, but he figures if you broke out in front of the whole yeshiva, it must be a message from heaven. He tells the Nachlas David the following: you know, my dear student, the day will come when the pillars of European Jewry will topple, and the yeshivas will be destroyed and uprooted. Says Reb Chaim, I want you to know there's one more stop before Mashiach comes. America. America is the last stop. This is 200 years ago. America is the last stop. Babylon, Bavel, North Africa, Egypt, Italy, Spain, France, Germany, Poland, Lithuania, America, the 10 stops of the Torah. By the way, this is not a legend. Rav Aaron Kotler in the Mishnah Rav Aaron records this as an authentic tradition. He writes, Hachania ha'achroina tia America. So here we are. Last stop on the train. No one knows how much longer we're going to be here. We hope we could be here b'shalom until the stop is over. But the verdict of history is, we're lucky if we make it out with the shirt on our back. And if there's one thing we learn from the omission of Spanish Jewry in the Tisha B'Av service, if there's one thing we could learn from the music that they played when they left Spain in 1492, is that we don't and we will not cry when we leave Galus. Because we never belonged in Spain, and we never belonged in North Africa or Egypt or Russia or any country we ever were in. We never belonged there because we belong in Eretz Yisrael. We belong in Yerushalayim. And if we're breathing and we're alive and we have a pulse, all you need to do is open your eyes and you see how every decade, every prophecy of the Nevi'im come true in front of our eyes. I remember when I was a kid, you had Iranians, Persians living in the basements in Flatbush, mass immigration. And then it was the Russians, and then it was the Ethiopians. Every decade, God takes another 100,000 Jews out of Golos to Eretz Yisrael. Only a few months ago we saw French Jewry. They're all going to Eretz Yisrael. There are not too many countries left on the list. And I guarantee you, we're coming up. And just as we left Spain triumphantly, don't forget, one day when the Rebbeinu Shem takes us out of America, we don't cry when we leave Golos. Don't get too comfortable. We don't belong here. May we all go up to Yerushalayim together. B'simcha, b'karov, b'vi'as koyel tzedek, v'inyan beis hamikdash meher v'yameinu.
You've just experienced another Torah class brought to you by TorahAnytime.com.